Hey there, art nerds! I've got another watercolor tutorial for you guys. This one is from Curious Little Things, my Lilliputian cottagecore coloring book. If that sounds like your jam, I'll have a link to that down in the description below, as well as a list of the materials that I used when painting this watercolor illustration, in case you're interested in what I've been working with, or you want to add some new fun supplies to your own watercolor setup. Today's tutorial has been sped up pretty significantly, so I'm not going to be able to go as in-depth for certain techniques as I might like, so also check the description below for relevant watercolor techniques that you guys might find helpful for this tutorial. For this one, we're going to dive right into the watercolor painting, and I'm going to start by using some masking fluid to mask out the light sources, so the candles in this instance, as well as some of the areas where that light might hit metallic or highly reflective objects. I'm also pulling out my palette of Daniel Smith's super granulating colors. I believe I am using Moon Glow primarily, and I applied an all-over wash of that, dabbed that out, and now I'm working on creating the glow effect with the candles. Basically, the way I do that is I paint a circle of yellow, fill in around that, and then kind of blend out with clean water. And this is going to kind of soften the transition between our background wash and the glow of the candles. I'm going to do a few layers of this, making the circles around the light source larger each time to create that look of glow. I'm also using a paper towel to lift it out of their faces as well as out of the window, because I actually want it to be sunset in the window, so not as dark as it's going to be inside. And I'm going to do several layers of this to really create that glow effect. I'm using Moon Glow because it is a beautiful granulating color that granulates purple and green, and it creates this sort of beautiful soft atmospheric glow effect. It's a really, really fun color for these sort of glow techniques, and it's one that I use pretty frequently. I am adding a little bit of a granulating purple from Daniel Smith. Not sure if it's Shadow Violet, not sure if it is another one of their super granulating colors, but they've got some beautiful granulating colors that are really helpful for this kind of work. I am working with a lot of water, so I am painting on Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press watercolor paper. This is a watercolor paper that can really take lots and lots and lots of water, so it's a good one for these kind of techniques today. I am working on the sunset in the background, so a lot of purples, red violets, and a little bit of orange down at the bottom, working quickly so that we can work wet into wet. And I'm really trying to build up the atmosphere on the interior. So here is a trick for painting light and light sources. You guys have probably heard the phrase, you can't have the light without the shadow, or you can't have the light without the dark. And a lot of people think we're getting philosophical when we say that, and sure, maybe having bad events can make the good events seem better, and vice versa. But when we're talking about art and we're talking about watercolor, what it also means is creating these darker, sort of more contrast, so that the lighter, brighter things really appear bright and really appear light. So to do that, I'm doing a lot of layers, a lot of underpainting, and a lot of toning wash to really start building that up. So for this illustration, most of the real heavy lifting is going to be done in these underpainting stages. So most of the heavy lifting is going to be done in monochrome. So it's really important to find monochromatic or, limited pigment mixes that will work well for this and that you like, color combinations that work well for you. And that really can depend on the illustration that you're creating. I wanted this to have kind of a warmer feel, very cozy, very friendly, very loving. We've got a mother and her son working together. She's reading to him while he's sewing, which is a pretty common practice from the past before we had computers and television. Somebody had to entertain the others while they were working. And I wanted to really kind of use the warm background colors to help push this coziness and this loving feeling and this warmth. So that's why I'm going with warmer purples, even moon glow. Sorry, almost my brain kept wanting to say shadow violet, but it's moon glow. Even moon glow, although it has a green in there, it's a warmer green, and it has a purple in there, and it has this just beautiful granulation that adds this really nice texture to the environment. I'm going to use this for the majority of the underpainting. So at this point, I'm starting to think about shadows and contrasts and what objects are blocking the light source and would create a sense of shadow. So I'm trying to do a lot of my environmental storytelling in this stage right now, and that's going to make the rest of the watercolor process a lot easier because then we can mostly focus on just adding local color. Something that I love about this kind of underpainting is that if it looks like it could be a standalone illustration as is without adding additional color, that's basically when you're ready to start adding local color. So I'm going to start adding a really warm background brown for the walls so they are inside a tree trunk, probably an oak tree. And I really want to make that apparent by the colors that I choose for this illustration. I really want you guys to get a feel for the environment from the colors. So we're using that as part of our storytelling. And I'm going to continue to push the glow effects even as I add the local colors. So you guys can see I left a little bit of a halo around the light source. I dabbed out some of the color using a clean paper towel. And I'm going to keep working in adding the shadows using local color to really build up that light source. And this is why it's so great to work with such an absorbent paper like the Stonehenge Aqua, is it can take all these layers. It does really need you to allow it to dry in between. So like when I applied that masking fluid you guys just saw, I had allowed the paper to dry out, but spoiler, I still had some problems removing it. That's one downside to Stonehenge Aqua is I have trouble removing masking fluid from it. I don't know if you guys have the same problems. There are some papers that adding and removing masking fluid is super easy, and then you have Stonehenge Aqua where it's kind of a coin toss. And I also want to point out that although this illustration has been time-lapsed to around 33 minutes, it really took about a week to paint, and that includes the dry times. It took about 6 hours of just recorded footage. That's not including all the drawing. So just be patient with yourself and give your work the time it takes to paint what you have in mind. In fact, when a time-lapse video is as sped up as this, it's actually very hard for me to cover the step by step. I have to talk really quickly in order to try to capture some things, and I still miss some things. So if you guys are interested, I would be happy to do a more in-depth tutorial for my patrons over on patreon.com/natosoup as a blog post, and that way I can talk about some things in more depth, and then you can compare the photos against the video. If you're a patron and that sounds like something you would like, let me know. I would be happy to do it. But otherwise, I'm going to link some tutorials that you guys might find helpful down in the description. So for their skin tones, I want to go with darker skin tones for these characters. And I find that painting in the shadows and the blush earlier on is really helpful because we're going to be working with a lot of earth pigments, and those have a tendency to not really like glazes, not really like adding a shadow color on top of it. When you're working with earth tones, you need to add those sort of layers more thickly. So I find that it's really better for me if I go ahead and start blocking in the shadows on the skin, like we used a purple to add the shadows to their skin in this example, and adding the blush. I'm using alizarin crimson with maybe a bit of naphthalide maroon mixed in, and that way we can sort of glaze our earth tones on top of these colors, and these will work really well for sort of the lighter areas of shadow, and then we can add our darker areas of shadow more thickly a little bit later on. I'm also starting to block in the background for the floor, and I'm trying to make sure I preserve the glow effect on the floor as well. So that's really what I'm trying to think about for this whole illustration, is preserving that feel of Candlelight. And I actually have some tutorials on how I have several tutorials actually where I talk about different ways to paint glow effects, different ways to handle glow effects. So I'll try to remember to share those with you guys down in the description, and hopefully you guys will check them out. For this tutorial, I'm also pulled pretty far out so you guys can actually see a lot of my setup. You can see my palette. You can also see the ceramic palettes that I use for mixing up colors and how I'm handling them. I'm using a rose palette that a friend of mine gave me. I really love this palette for these kinds of illustrations where I have a lot of smaller things to paint and I'm going to need to mix a bunch of colors and make sure that they're fairly evenly mixed on the brush so that we can do an even application. This will help hold those colors and that way I can revisit them if I want to do more saturated layers. So I really like this palette and it works really well. And if you are looking for a good multi-weld palette for this sort of art, I'll try to remember to link it for you guys down in the description. So for the rug under their feet, I'm doing a rag rug and I want to use the same gingham pattern that I used on the little curtain in the background. But the first thing I'm doing is I'm using some ultramarine blue to kind of start like pre-establishing the base blue for the base white for the rug, because we're going to be painting the stripes later on as a surface design. So this allows me to start blocking in some of the shadows and to start giving the rug a little bit more of its fun, a little bit more of its form. If you've ever looked at a rag rug, it actually, the way they do it is they kind of make a braided rope of rags and then they sew that in kind of a spiraling pattern. So that's what I wanted to replicate here, and I wanted the viewer to be able to see that. For their skin, I'm starting with a mix of burnt umber with a little bit of Van Dyke brown, and I'm working with it pretty desaturated, just kind of like as our base. So I'm going to build up my color more saturated from here on, but this is giving us our lightest highlights, which are useful for, say, the palms of the hand, or maybe the bottoms of the feet, or areas that are getting more of the candle's light than other areas. So remember, we're thinking about building up the appearance of light. And to do that, we have to create the appearance of shadow, but we do need to make sure we have those like lightest values in place. Once that layer's dried, I'm going in with a slightly more saturated mix, and I am trying to make sure that I am conveying the form. So at this point, I'm mostly just reserving kind of the palms of the hands and just kind of filling in the rest. So this will be our like second layer of skin tone. So this is going to be the main base layer for the majority of their skin. I'm also painting in the wood grain pattern on the doorway here. I'm using a darker color that matches the floor, and that's going to give us a little bit of contrast on the walls. And I'm still trying to think about what color I want to use for the door and whether I want to use that as a framing device or if I want to just have it kind of blend in as the background. As the skin tone dries, you can actually see the purple shadow layer that I added before start to come through, and this is what I mean by doing the underpainting with purple and adding the shadows first. Really helps with these sort of darker skin tones because it allows us to start establishing some of those lighter areas that would still be a bit shadowed or would be influenced by like the form moving away from the light source. It allows us to get that kind of established earlier in. So like we're not trying to glaze like a really light wash of purple on top of everything and having it all kind of reactivate and lift up. So to get the gingham pattern on the rug, I'm starting by doing stripes going one direction, kind of following the spirals of the rug. And I'm going to allow those to dry before I paint the stripes going in the alternate direction, crisscrossing over them. At this point, I remove the masking fluid from the washi tape that's going along the floorboards, and I start to have some problems with the masking fluid tearing the paper. So now that the first layer of stripes have dried, I can go over them with ultramarine blue again in the opposite direction, and you guys can see where the stripes cross, we get a darker version of the blue. This is a really easy pattern to replicate, and it works really well when you're painting tiny people because it gives this kind of sense of scale. So it's one you guys will see me use often because it's cute and it works well, and it's fairly easy for people to be able to do. For the silvery metal in this illustration, I'm using Payne's Gray. I'm going to start with a really light wash of it and just kind of fill in all of the areas that would be this kind of aluminum color, and then go in with a slightly more saturated wash to start kind of building up the metallic accents to this. So originally with the washi tape along the floorboard, I was kind of hoping that I could just leave the mushrooms, the masked out color from the background wall, but because removing the masking tape tore up the paper and left like a lot of white tearing and a lot of white speckles, I ended up having to kind of rethink how I handled it, and I instead opted to do kind of a light brown for the base and a darker red than the background for the tops. I do think kind of the negative painting mushrooms would have been really cute for this, but sometimes masking fluid in your paper have other plans and you just have to learn how to problem solve and roll with it. So my goal with that is to just kind of try to mask it and make it look like it was what I intended all along. At this point, I'm ready to work on the light sources in earnest. So I'm going to remove the masking fluid from the candles. The masking fluid ended up tearing the paper again, so I couldn't just leave it the white of the paper. So I ended up going in with a warm yellow, then a little bit of New Gamboge, then a little bit of red, all wet into wet. So they kind of bleed out and we get kind of this like soft flame effect from our light source. I've also decided to do brass fittings on the door in the background. So I'm starting with a yellow ochre and then I move on to Quin Gold. Any of my friends who are familiar with sewing will recognize the tomato and the pepper pincushions. I wanted to make sure that they were recognizable. So I used the trademark reds for that, and alizarin crimson, then moving towards a naphthalide maroon as we move towards shadow. Now that we've got a fair amount of the environment blocked in, I've decided what I want to do with the door. And I'm kind of leaning in a hobbity direction where we go with a more brightly colored door than just a plain wood door. So the interior of the door is kind of this warm, rich red, which is already kind of echoed in the pincushions as well as the washi tape along the floorboards. So once I've got things kind of blocked in, I decided I want to make the floor even darker. This is going to give us more contrast because right now the characters and the floor, the color is all kind of around the same value. So I want to make the floor a little bit darker, and that's going to really kind of help push the glow effect. It's going to help push the lighting effect, and hopefully it's going to make the other colors in the illustration pop a little bit more. I talk pretty often about how frequently I watercolor and how important watercolor is to me, and usually that's within the framework of I have early onset arthritis, traditional inking, traditional penciling, that's really hard on my hands. Watercolor is a little bit easier, but it's also really helpful in, as someone with ADHD, helping me kind of regulate my emotions and helping me to kind of calm down. So watercolor art and illustration is really important to me, not only in a way that I can communicate sort of my best thoughts and feelings, that the things that I want other people to know or feel about me, but it also kind of allows me to recenter myself and to relax and to wind down. It's just a really important part of my day-to-day life, and I'm really happy that I can share it with you guys. And I hope that over the years, my tutorials or my paint-alongs have inspired you to try watercolor, or have given you a new appreciation for this art form, or at least maybe have helped you use art in a therapeutic way to help you find something that makes you happy, or to find happiness within yourself. So as I'm working on this illustration, I'm kind of still deciding on the colors. Generally, I don't like deciding on the colors ahead of time. I may make notes to myself about a general color palette, but I really like to go more along the lines of like the feeling of the piece. And while, yeah, you could definitely do that in advance, and lots of artists do, I kind of like doing that as I'm working on the piece because it allows me to make adjustments and to make accommodations, like when the masking tape or the masking fluid tore the paper, being able to make adjustments on the fly is really helpful. These on-the-fly adjustments particularly extended to the clothing that these characters are wearing. I wanted it to, when I say be a reflection of the environment, I don't necessarily mean like repeating what's in the environment, but more a response to kind of the vibe that the environment has, but also what the environment is lacking. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to use some really bright, saturated colors, so repeating some of the reds, but also adding in some green and even some yellow with a floral pattern on her skirt, just to kind of add a little bit of playfulness and vibrancy and to show a little bit of her personality in the illustration. I mentioned using watercolor to help regulate my mood and to help me calm down earlier, but I'd like to revisit like the thought of using illustration to kind of communicate the best of yourself, your best intentions, your wishes for the world, the kind of energy and love that you want to put out there. And I love using, not quite portraiture, like I love doing storytelling illustrations, storytelling comics, because I want to just put forth these feelings of like love and peacefulness that I'm not always able, again, as somebody with ADHD, I'm not always able to put that out into the world just by being myself. So I like to use illustration as a way to share my real authentic self, the vulnerable part of me, with other people in a way that I can maybe curate a little bit better. My fellow ADHD friends probably know what I'm talking about. I don't know if you guys have the phrase foot and mouth disease to mean like you tend to say things and they come out wrong, and then people can take them the wrong way and often not give you the chance to actually explain what you mean. And something that I love about comics and art and illustration is it's a chance to theoretically put something out there that's really from the heart. And because there's such a visual component attached, you guys can see the facial expressions. You guys can see this really loving mother and child bonding moment where they're working together on a shared task. She's reading to him while he's sewing, which is something that people have done historically, whether it's, reading to people while they're working on another slightly more menial, more boring task, or the singing, leading a song, playing a musical instrument, telling stories, telling jokes. Like, it's an act of love to be a storyteller and to tell stories, to entertain and to amuse and to distract others from their lives, both good and bad. And that's something that I love about making comics and that I love about making illustrations, is that you have this opportunity to help other people take a break from their lives, get some perspective on their lives, and then come back maybe renewed and refreshed. So that's kind of the energy that I wanted to put forth into the world with this illustration, like this sort of taking a quiet break, relaxing together, enjoying one another's company together, and bonding while we make something beautiful, while we work on something that can be shared with other people. And hopefully that's what I was able to do with this illustration today. And the time-lapse nature of this doesn't quite allow me to share every single step in a lot of detail. So I thought instead it would be nice to talk about the kind of energy that I want to put out there and the kind of emotions I want to put in the world that I'm not always the most successful at putting out into the world. And I think this is something that requires a huge amount of vulnerability to share illustration in this way. It requires a fair amount of risk. And I think other artists who do this are very brave, whether you are a super proficient artist that everyone knows and loves, or you're a nobody who's just doing your best to put things out into the world to amuse others and so that others can feel seen. I think that takes a tremendous amount of courage. And I think it doesn't get the love or the appreciation that it deserves on social media, because honestly, it can be a little bit more challenging to look at than a beautiful bouquet of flowers or a particularly well painted apple. And it can be very discouraging. And I see other artists talk about this as well, to spend so much time working on something that's meant to be a labor of love, a labor of communication and sharing with others, and to have it received so poorly or just not received at all. And it's something that I struggle with as well. So I guess I just wanted to use this as a chance to say you're not alone. You're not alone in your struggles. And I think that if you're doing this, whether you're just starting out or you've been doing this forever, that you are tremendously brave. And I hope you'll continue doing it, because my favorite art on the internet are comics and storytelling art. And I love seeing it, and I would love to see more of it. So circling back, we've got all the local color kind of blocked in. Things are looking pretty done. But as I'm looking at the illustration, I'm thinking to myself, there isn't enough contrast. We can't really tell that they're working by candlelight. We're not really getting enough of the lighting, because the lighting is so important to creating the environment here. It creates this cozy, very sort of intimate, just two little people working together in their tiny little home. I really want you guys to feel cozy looking. I want you looking at this, I really want you guys to feel safe and protected and cared for. And the lighting is such an important part of that. That's why we're doing this by candlelight. So I'm going back in with our moon glow, and I'm adding in more shadows. I'm trying to create more contrast. I'm creating more darkness so that we can really appreciate the light source that we have. So with really dark hair colors, where we're going to be working with a really saturated mix of paint, I usually save that to just about the end, when I'm not going to be adding any more really light glazes to try and influence the colors, because since these are such rich saturated mixes, they can be very prone to reactivating and bleeding if they're next to, a wash of water. So this is like when I'm adding in kind of the final details, really trying to pull everything together, maybe adding in just some final touches here and there, particularly the more saturated ones. And when I'm painting, I will work from large brushes to smaller brushes, large fills of color to smaller detail, really loose, desaturated washes to really saturated, dry over wet applications. Now, sometimes I like to mix things up because I might want some of that bleed. I might want some of that color influencing other colors, but I try to be really strategic about when I do that so that it's not an accident and it's more intentional, even if it's not exactly the way I had it in mind. Now, this illustration is a more controlled illustration. I have some looser illustrations that in some ways are more joyful, a more joyful exploration of the color. But for this one, I really wanted to focus on this moment between a mother and her son working on a shared project together, her reading to him while he's sewing. So once I've mostly finished with the watercolor, and you guys see me actually adjusting her skin tone, adjusting her face, adding a little bit more shadow, because we are all about that storytelling here, and we're using the light as part of our storytelling in this illustration. But you guys have seen me pull out my watercolor pencils, and those are really useful for kind of adding those final details or adjusting some of the color. Like for example, with the light sources here, I actually added in a little bit of extra yellow so that we get more of that kind of warm glow in the environment. My personal recommendation when using watercolor pencils is to wait till the paper is dry. I like to use them to kind of apply a field of color, and then I'll use the water to kind of blend them out. With the Derwent Inktense, you have to be careful about that technique because those tend to be way more intense once you've added the water and they've kind of activated and they're moving around than most other watercolor pencils. And to be fair, they are India ink based, as are the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer. So technically not watercolor pencils, but I use them as watercolor pencils, so I'm going to lump them into that. I'm also using Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle and Supercolor 2. These are all pencils that I really like. I've reviewed a bunch of different watercolor pencils in the past, and these are my 4 favorites. So I've seen some other pen and ink watercolor artists talk about how they find black ink may be too harsh for their illustration and that gray ink more closely replicates graphite. I think that's super cool. As somebody who comes from a foot in the comics world where inking, at least during my education, was such a big part of the process, I've kind of learned to mentally accommodate the ink. For the most part, I do love me some colored inks. That's more with the alcohol markers that I'm using. But when it comes to watercolor, I've kind of learned to mentally accommodate the ink. That said, sometimes when I paint on top of my inked art, I lose some of the contrast that we get from the black ink, and it makes everything feel kind of muddy. So it can be helpful once everything's had a chance to dry to do a little bit of spot re-inking. And for that, I like to use my Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. Yeah, those are waterproof. And that is the brush pen that I initially inked this illustration with, which is probably why I'm grabbing it, but it's also just a good all-rounder brush pen. So when you guys see me pull out the white gouache, you know we are just about done. When the gouache highlights have dried, I'm going to remove my blue painter's tape, pulling away from the art at a 90-degree angle. This illustration has sat on a stretcher board for several months before I could actually get around to painting it, so the tape wants to stick to the gator board and the paper a little bit more than usual. I have tried using a hair dryer to soften the adhesive and ease removing the tape. I have found that that does not make it any easier for me. So you can try that, and if that works for you, that is wonderful. It does not work for me. And there we have it, another completed watercolor illustration. I'm so glad I could share this process and share some of myself and hopefully some of my better nature with you guys. Sharing these tutorials and sharing these illustrations with you guys is just really important to me, and it makes me really happy to be able to put a better side of myself out there into the world. And hopefully I've left you guys feeling inspired, whether you're a neurodivergent person and you'd like to use art to communicate more with other people, or you're somebody who's looking to carve a little piece into your day and you're interested in picking up watercolor. I sure hope you will. I have a bunch of tutorials, whether it is drawing, inking, watercolor, or just art in general, or comics. I've got a bunch of tutorials here on the channel that I hope you guys will check out. This illustration is from my coloring book, Curious Little Things. I will link it down in the description below. If you color this illustration along with me, I would love to see it. The book also has a special download link where you can download high-res scans to print them out on your paper of choice, so you are not just limited to the book itself. Thank you guys again so much for painting with me today. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you guys enjoy this watercolor illustration of two tinies working together by candlelight. Tutorials like this are made possible thanks to my amazing, phenomenal, and fantastic patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for all that you do.